reinterpreting epics. That's the topic that we have for the next session. And to discuss this in detail, let me invite on the stage our panelists, Mr. Bibek Debroy, Mr. B.N. Patnaik, Mr. Haraprasad Das, and Mr. Christopher C. Doyle. Can we have a huge round of applause for all of them? Mr. Bibek Debroy, a professional economist, started his career as an academician. In 2010, he started authoring a 10-volume unabridged English translation of the Mahabharata. This year, he has jointly written Getting India Back on Track, an Action Agenda for Reform and Economic Freedom of the States of India. Mr. B.N. Patnaik has spent the greater part of his working life at IIT Kanpur. He has published papers on a variety of topics in theoretical and computational linguistics, social linguistics, communication, and more recently, medieval Odia literature. He has written the first generative grammar partial of Odia and is the associate editor of Pearson's English Odia Dictionary. Murthy Devi Award winner in 2012, Mr. Haraprasad Das is the most influential poet and thinker in contemporary Odia literature. He has brought out 13 collections of poems, a compilation of short fiction, 4 collections of essays, numerous translations, and few books of edited works in Odia. In 2012, he won the 26th Murthy Devi Award for Vamsha, a series of poems based on the epic Mahabharata. Christopher C. Doyle is an author who transports the reader into a fascinating world where ancient secrets buried in legends blend with science and history to create a gripping story. His debut novel, The Mahabharata Secret, published in 2013, was an instant bestseller and was in the top 10 crossword best of 2013 list. His second novel, The Mahabharata Quest, The Alexander Secret, was released in 2014. I would now request Mr. Haraprasad Das to chair this session and take it forward from here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Diksha. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an extremely complex subject to deal with. The subject is reinterpreting epics. Now, by consent amongst the participants panel, there is an excellent panel before me. Mr. Debroy, may I remind some of you that he has undertaken the stupendous task of translating the Mahabharata into English in 10 volumes, and I believe the first volume is already published. And Mr. Christopher Doyle surprised me. I just read a review of his latest book, and I really wonder how he connects Mahabharata with Alexander, but he has done it. And that is the secret of Mahabharata. So he is a formidable panelist. Professor Patnaik here is a former professor, as Diksha said, and an eminent linguist. And more importantly, I think he knows all about the language we flounder with and flounder about. So with this kind of a panel and this kind of a subject, hopefully this would be an entertaining and interesting session for you. Now, if the panelists agree, are we going to talk about all the epics in general, or shall we pick up Mahabharata, for instance, as one of the leading subjects, because both of you have worked on it? Or, yeah, okay. Now, in that case, let me go away from Mahabharata and begin with something much more interesting. A few months ago, there was a session of Japanese literature which was reported, where the tale of Genji, there is an ancient text of 11th century which was being discussed with the haiku masters. The Zen master asked a question as to, if you have read the tale of Genji, interpret it. There were many interpretations. Then the interpretations were reinterpreted. And after many reinterpretations, the master asked the students as to, what did you finally get? The answer to that was, finally they got his tale of Genji. So Mahabharata is a subject much more potent even the tale of Genji, which is an 11th century work, and Mahabharata is placed sometime before Christ. That being the case, I think we will take up epics in general, and we will specifically dwell on the most important epic of the world, the greatest, the grandest, and the mightiest of epics in the world to have been created. And let me remind the audience here that when we talk of epics and we talk of Mahabharata, I really have a desire to dedicate this session to one person who gave us our first epic. The first Odia epic was given by Sarala Das in 15th century. So I dedicate this session to Sarala Das, who gave us Mahabharata, the first Odia epic and perhaps the grandest epic recreation from the original Sanskrit text, but totally deviating and recreating it for the Odia readers. So I dedicate this session to Sarala Das. Now in the opening portion of Adi Parva in Mahabharata, there is an expression which needs consideration. Achakyu kabaya kechit samprata chakhyate pare akhyasyanti tathe danne itihasamimam bhuvi. On this earth, some poets have in the past spoken this account. Some are speaking about it now. Some more will speak about it in future. So this is an epic. I don't think a better definition of an epic is required about. The subject matter was spoken about in the past, the subject matter is being spoken about it now, and the subject matter will be spoken about in future also. So that is an epic for you. And ladies and gentlemen, the narrative of Mahabharata, Bhagavat Puran and Ramayana are the three Indian epics we have in view. The panelists can pick up whatever epic they wish to, but I would request them, perhaps in the interest of better focus, to concentrate on these three particular epics, and if they wish, they can perhaps concentrate on any one of them. The Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Bhagavat Puran. Incidentally, Mahabharata was created for Odia readers by Sarala Das in the 15th century. Bhagavat Puran was recreated for Odia readers by Jagannath Das in 16th century, and Ramayana also was created by Balaram Das in 16th century. So by the time these 200 years passed, 15th and 16th centuries, Odia had all the three major epics of the Indian civilization. So ladies and gentlemen, the Mahabharata is a very interesting and complex and a formidable narrative. The narrative structure is such that you get a clue of the symbolic significance of the epic from the very manner in which it was narrated. If you go very carefully, this was written by Krishna Dvaipayan. Krishna, the dark man who was born in an island. The interpretation to that could be that Jambu Dipare jane kala loko yaku lekhichi. A black man who wrote this in Jambu Dipa. Okay. Now this was narrated to a person whose name was Vaisampayan. Vaisampayan would mean a great grand compiler. And Vaisampayan narrated the story to Janmejaya. Janmejaya is the person who is eternal, who has conquered life and death. In that sense, it is addressed to eternity. And who heard it? It was heard by Ugrasarva. Ugrasarva is the man who can hear it the tiniest noise also anywhere, and he is the man who heard it and recorded it in his mind. And he is the man who described to whom he narrated the story to the sages who were practicing penance in Naimisaranya, a forest. So it is nature, it is infinite time, it is infinite endless possibilities with which the very narrative structure opens up. So this is Mahabharata for you. Now having said that, I must clear first of all a conception which we have relating to epic, which may not be easily understood. It's often confused with myth or mythology. An epic may contain a myth, may contain hundreds of myths, but myth or mythology and epic are two different things altogether. Now, mythology and epic are differentiated by the scale, by the size or grand scale by which they are differentiated. A civilizational grand narrative that renders itself to multiple interpretation is an epic, while a myth encapsulates an experience, a tradition, a tale symbolically that ends in itself. A single myth would not be in a position to contain this whole civilization, whereas an epic could contain a whole of a civilization. We have in epic tradition Mahakabya and Purana, and let me tell you, and all of you know about it, these are all written in poetry. So, the wisdom of selection of this topic, I must thank Prabhuji for selecting reinterpretation, particularly selecting the word reinterpretation and not interpretation, because all translations of Mahabharata, which have happened since the pre-Christian period until now, are translations or rewritings, whatever you call it, and in the process of writing it in another language, a certain recreation is taking place and an interpretation also is taking place simultaneously. Thereafter, we have come to a time now when a large amount of reinterpretations are taking place. Mr. Natwar Singh is present here, and there's an interesting thing I read in a seminar paper of the Sahitya Academy. I believe in 1965, Sukarno is believed to have linked his fate to Karna of Mahabharata. It's an amazing thing that Sukarno of Indonesia was linking his fate with Karna of Mahabharata when he was in the brink of defeat. That, be that as may, the fact remains that in Indian subcontinent and even outside the Indian subcontinent, a large diaspora exists which could be called the Grand Mahabharata diaspora in terms of consciousness. There are many people who have linked their fates to the texts of Mahabharata. The names apart, places apart, beliefs apart, there are ways of thinking also which have been influenced by the Mahabharata. But this reinterpretation which we are talking of at present, what would it really mean? It could mean rewriting with a modern idiom. It could mean rediscovering some overlaid facts. It could mean relating to the curse of mankind, war and strife. It could mean finding contemporary parallels. It could mean identifying the historical markers in the text. It could mean isolating events for detailed examination. It could also mean refocusing on some lesser known aspects or researching for some new elements. Taking the case of the Mahabharata, there are many reinterpretations and many texts have developed in India. Andha Yug, for example, Dharmveer Bharati's Andha Yug is being staged until today and is considered to be a masterpiece. Then you have a very, very, my own favorite interpretation of Mahabharata or reinterpretation of Mahabharata, Iravati Karve's Yugant. It is a small book, but I think it's very, very important. We have, any one of you might have read it, Devdutt Patnaik, an Odia, The Pregnant King. It's a story from Mahabharata, fictionalized. Then we have our own Pratibha Rai, who was chairing the previous session, having written about Jagyaseni. Then there is a book on Bhimsen by M.T. Basudevan Nair from Kerala. Then there is a book from Maharashtra on Karna's wife, that is by Kavita Kane. Then you have a play by Girish Karnad called Yajati, picking out a story from the Mahabharata. Then you have a very, very erudite essay by Buddhadev Basu, that is the book of Yudhishthir. You even have a book by Mahaswata Devi after Kurukshetra. Umpteen number of books. As a matter of fact, I would not call them really reinterpretations of Mahabharata. I would call them reinterpretation of some of the episodes from the Mahabharata. Because Mahabharata can be reinterpreted only by a Mahabharatic text, and you do not have another Mahabharata text coming up. Now, the techniques that are used for reinterpretation, the reason I am clarifying this because I am straight away coming to the subject matter so that it facilitates my panelists. Metaphors are extended, and today you see a number of films on the telefilms where the storyline has been completely distorted. So by extending the metaphor, you do not recognize even the original story. There are semblances explored and there are continuities established. Then marginal players are being valorized. Then the center has been decentered. The contexts have been thrown away. Then the heroics have been debunked. Subtexts have started growing and many rough edges have been polished. Then the storylines have been telescoped and rewritings and reconstructions galore after. What you have, just as I told you about the tale of Genji, you still have the Mahabharata, which has not been replicated. So these are the various techniques and methods by which we have reinterpreted Mahabharata, but truly speaking, the Mahabharata has not been reinterpreted. It is a seminal text. It represents a civilization. And if you ask me, anybody who could have really done some kind of a reinterpretation that would be in folklore and in the tribal mythology. In the tribal mythology and folklore, there are whole of parallel texts available. A Bhim or an Arjun or a Karna or a Draupadi, whether it is south or north, you have almost parallel texts available, but most of that is in the oral tradition. We do not have a written replica of Mahabharata anywhere else. So this is the context and the background in which the questions that we automatically ask, how could this be possible? How could this be possible? Mahabharata, how was it possible? And why was it becoming possible? An explanation has been given that Mahabharata became possible because of a tectonic change through which the society was passing. I do not see what exactly the tectonic change was there, but I can see very well that there must have been tremendous amount of social upheaval in the background of which Mahabharata must have been conceived. We are here not to ask the question as to how Mahabharata was written or why Mahabharata was written or why it is being interpreted or reinterpreted. The crucial question that we would address ourselves is, in the process of interpreting and reinterpreting the Mahabharata several times over, the process is continuing. We have still not exhausted this text. Are we on track or have we deviated from a civilizational guideline which the Mahabharata has placed before us? For instance, it is possible to frustrate the design of Mahabharata by totally debunking the heroic methodology adopted in this particular book. Let me first of all ask a question to my first panelist whom I address, Mr. Deb Roy. He has translated the Mahabharata into English. First volume is out. The question to him is, and he can of course, he is at liberty to proceed further from there. The first translation of the Mahabharata was published in English translation of Mahabharata in 1883 to 1896. Kesari Mohan Ganguly translated the Mahabharata into English. Now the question to him is, why does he think it is important to do yet one more translation of the Mahabharata? This is the question, and from there he can take me in any channel he wishes to take me. Mr. Deb Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by thanking Prabhu Chawla in particular and the New Indian Express for having invited me here, particularly to this very interesting session. Mr. Chairman, I will answer your question in a minute. But before that, there are three things I sort of want to flag almost in bulleted fashion. Firstly, the chairman made a reference to the word epic, which is there in the heading of this session. In Sanskrit, of course, there is a specific definition of what is called a Mahakavya. And there are other Mahakavyas, there are classic characteristics that a Mahakavya must satisfy, and there are other Mahakavyas also, in addition to the Valmiki Ramayana, Veda Vyasa's Mahabharata, and the Bhagavad Purana. Having said that, the Ramayana, the Valmiki Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the word used is itihasa. Itihasa literally translates as, this is indeed what happened. And it is important therefore to underline this, and the chairman also mentioned this, that these are not myths in that sense. They represent, or at least in terms of beliefs, they represent a core element of historical fact, on top of which there may have been embellishments. Let me now focus on the Mahabharata. There is a question, of course, of dating the Mahabharata. And when we say dating the Mahabharata, it is important to separate out the date of the Kurukshetra war, which is a different issue, from the date when the Mahabharata was composed. To the best of our understanding, the Mahabharata was composed in layers. I'm talking about composition, I'm talking about oral transmission, I'm not talking about writing. It wasn't in writing. To the best of our understanding, this process in layers took something like 1,000 years, probably attaining the final form around the Gupta period. It's important to remember this because over 1,000-year period, social norms change. So if I am, for instance, interested in the position of women in the Mahabharata, I can cite you chapter and verse to illustrate that women did not have that inferior a position. Simultaneously, I can also cite chapter and verse to illustrate that women did have an inferior status. And I'm particularly picking on gender because I can see Madhu sitting there. But the simple point I'm making is in terms of norms, you cannot expect consistency over a period of 1,000 years. And it is huge. The Mahabharata, of course, when I keep saying the Mahabharata, I mean the Sanskrit Mahabharata. The chairman quite rightly observed that several of our perceptions about the Mahabharata are on the basis of popular retelling, sometimes in vernacular. Insofar as the Sanskrit Mahabharata is concerned, there were about 1,200 different versions of the Sanskrit Mahabharata floating around in India. All of them were not equally important. About 10 of them were perhaps more important than the others, but there were about 1,200 different versions floating around. In the year 1916, the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune decided to perform a mammoth exercise. They decided to sit down with these 1,200 different versions, sift through them, and try and determine, to the extent one could, what was the critical version. Critical does not mean authentic. All critical meant was this story exists in multiple versions, so therefore perhaps this story was there in the original. This critical version of the Mahabharata, the Bhandarkar Institute took 50 years to complete it, 1916 to 1966, 50 years. This version runs into 85,000 shlokas. Most people here will probably know that according to the popular perception, the Mahabharata has 100,000 shlokas, while the critical version has 85,000 shlokas. In terms of the translation that the chairman mentioned, it is indeed in 10 volumes. 8 volumes are out. The remaining 2 volumes are going to be published this month. To give you an idea of how huge the Mahabharata is, that entire thing runs into 2.25 million words. So it's about 225,000 words a volume. Why should I do it? Contrary to what you might think, unabridged translations of the Mahabharata in English are very rare. What you see are abridged translations of the Mahabharata. Unabridged translations in the vernacular do exist. Unabridged translations in English are extremely rare. They have only been done 1.5 times in the past. I will explain the half. There were others who attempted it. University of Chicago attempted it. Professor Van Wuytenen attempted it. He died halfway. Pilal's was a bit of a transcreation. He also died. I'm coming to Kishori Mohan Ganguly. Pilal's was more of a transcreation, but he also died before it could be completed. So Wendy Doniger had actually sent me an email saying, please don't try to do this. It's hazardous for health. So Kishori Mohan Ganguly was the one. He completed it, as you said, between 1883 and 1895. There was another gentleman who actually plagiarized Kishori Mohan Ganguly. And his name was Manmathanath Datta, which is why I said half. Why am I translating it? A, because Kishori Mohan Ganguly used the Eastern edition, what is called the Bardhaman edition. He didn't translate everything. The language is archaic. Despite it being the Mahabharata, there are things that were perceived to have hunted the sensitivities of that age, so he didn't translate that. So that's the reason I'm doing it. The last sentence, and then I will stop. Just one illustration, and I'll stop. Why is it important I mention the norms of that period? Everyone here is familiar with the incident of Draupadi being dragged into the assembly hall and being disrobed. And we have seen depictions of that incident, we have read about that incident, and we know about Duryodhan bearing his thigh towards Draupadi. And we invariably understand that as an obscene gesture. What we tend to forget is, in that day and age, the left lap or the left thigh was meant for the wife. The right lap or the right thigh was meant for the daughter or the daughter-in-law. So contrary to what our perception may be, in that Sanskrit Mahabharata, all that Duryodhan was doing, in so far as that particular incident is concerned, is inviting Draupadi to accept him as a husband. No obscenity. And I am flagging this because when we reinterpret, please let us remember that the social norms of that day and age need not necessarily be those of this particular age.
Mr. Debroy's intervention has raised a very small question. I would straight away go to Mr. Doyle to respond to that, even though you are not directly connected with that kind of material. Now, whether, insofar as an epic is concerned, whether it was perfectly in order at a particular point of time to sit on the right thigh or left thigh, be it as may, when we are producing a text for contemporary consumption at the present moment, whether the texts are required to be sanitized when you do a reinterpretation, because sanitized texts are available aplenty in respect of many of the great writings which are more than 100 years old. So should the epic material be sanitized for contemporary consumption depending on the contemporary social needs, or every text has to have an interpretation attached to it without which the text would not be read in the proper social context? Mr. Doyle, I'll come back to you, Mr. Debroy, later. Could you like to react to that?
So, I'm going to answer this question from my perspective, which is not
Your perspective.
Yeah. So it's not really about reinterpreting the entire epic or indeed contemporarizing the epic, because what I do is take a theme or the theme from the Mahabharata and elucidate this and place it in a contemporary setting. So I wouldn't say that I'm doing it with the intention, conscious intention of making parts of the shlokas more relevant or contemporary. I think what I'm trying to do basically is answering the question, what if? As Mr. Debroy very rightly pointed out, the epics are itihasa. And that's the premise with which I started when I started writing my books. I have a confession to make, though. I never started it with a lofty, idealistic ambition of trying to interpret or rewrite the epics. In fact, my first book was actually started off as a story for my daughter. But I read a very interesting book about 15 years ago by Akshay Majumdar called The Hindu History. I don't know if my fellow panelists have seen this book. It's a very interesting book where he's taken all the scriptures and he's created an alternate history of India in prehistoric times, going all the way up back to about 4,500 BC. He's given names of kings, he's given the Suryavanshis, the Chandravanshis, he's put everything out there. And given the fact that the epics are itihasa, this really started that germ in my mind of how do we really perceive our epics? And do we really consider it to be something that could have happened? Or are we rightly look at the philosophical underpinnings and try to derive ideas from it? But do we really look at the what if this actually happened? And what I find is that there are things, so in my latest book, which you were talking about, where you mentioned how did I link Alexander the Great and the Mahabharata. When I was reading I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, so I relied on the help of 5 Sanskrit scholars and some papers to interpret the shlokas. But I found some very interesting interpretations of the shlokas, which could actually be explained by science. And if you think this is far-fetched, you should read the Sushrita Samhita, which talks about it's a 3,000-year-old text written by one of the first physicians of India. And he talks about surgery, he talks about blood transfusion. I'm about 75% through it, the English version. And it's not, if you were to look at this as a historical epic, describing events that might have happened, well, why not science? Why can't we use science to explain it? And that's where the connection comes in. I think science is what we understand today. Technology is what we understand today.
This is interesting, yeah.
In my book, I've actually given the interpretation, the traditional interpretation of each shloka. And if you were to interpret it using modern scientific theory, you can actually see that there's a correlation, or so I believe.
Yeah, this is a very interesting dimension. This is a very interesting dimension. Not only are the episodes being interpreted, here is an author who picks up a sloka from the Mahabharata, finds out exactly how it can be understood scientifically, and tries to derive a historical material out of that as a secret. It's as if it is a secret code. Now, historical, I would like to make a small interjection about this epic and history. Not all epics are histories. Only Mahabharata is considered to be history. Bhagavad Purana is not considered to be history. Similarly, Ramayana is also not considered to be history. It's only Mahabharata which is considered to be history. So epics could be historical accounts, it could be non-historical heroic accounts also. Be it as may. Now, when you are one person who has gone into the Mahabharata without really studying it as a part of your ethnic literature. You have perhaps not grown up with Mahabharata, did you?
I have.
You have grown up with Mahabharata. So when you picked up the stories from childhood, and when you thought of linking Alexander to Mahabharata and talking about Mahabharata secret, did you not feel that in your mind the sanctity and the importance that is attached to this seminal text in your childhood is not the same anymore when you look at it with a scientist's eye? When you are picking up a portion, a sloka, and giving it a meaning and trying to use it for the purpose of a fiction, you are really not rewriting or reinterpreting the mythology, part of Mahabharata. What you are trying is you are using Mahabharata to advance a thesis. Now, when you do that, is that the way our epics should be treated in literature?
It's a
What do you
great
like?
question. And I'd like to answer it by first clarifying that my thesis is that there is science in the Mahabharata. And that could be a subject of debate, but that's the way I look at it. So in my first book, for example, in my first book, I linked Ashoka the Great and the Mahabharata. And the way I would like to look at it is that I bring in the historical angle to substantiate the thesis that I'm propounding, which is that there are parts of the Mahabharata which could contain science. Well, why not? If a shloka says, if a shloka says a certain thing happened, it may not be a literal occurrence that's being described, but it could be a scientific occurrence that's been described. I mean, for example, there are examples abound of medicinal plants and herbs, and we know that to be true. There are plants that are described in the Mahabharata which may be around now, I don't know. But we do have a science based on herbal medicines which is accepted and works, and it's effective, and it's being recognized more and more. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, now, no, we can, yeah. Now we have one more panelist to shoot off, whom we have not heard yet. Now, he's a professor and he has dealt with this subject in many different ways. When a final text of a grand narrative gets fixed, any amount of interpretation or reinterpretation you do, the original work remains fixed. You cannot unsettle it, you cannot change it, you can only use it as a part of your racial memory by recall. Now, Dr. Patnaik, just tell me, what renders an epic like Mahabharata eternally renewable? How come this particular text is being renewed from age to age, generation after generation, and yet it is so inexhaustible? What could be that element which makes it eternally renewable? Yeah.
I thank the New Indian Express for giving me an opportunity to talk to you here on a little bit of Sarala Mahabharata. So I am directly interested in the question of reinterpretation and Sarala. So may I answer the question later?
Sure.
May I answer the question?
Sure, you can take both the questions together, both the issues together.
Yeah, so say when Sarala we know did not translate Vyasa's Mahabharata. He reconceptualized it and retold it. And when he did that, obviously a significant number of episodes were treated very, very differently. I have discussed this, presented this in many of my articles and my book. I have 2 books on Sarala Mahabharata, all in English. See, what I do is, I'm a very humble presenter of Sarala Mahabharata. So when I tell Sarala stories, I do not take the kind of freedom that Sarala took with Vyasa. I stick to Sarala. Make sure that what I am saying is not in dissonance with the spirit in which Sarala wrote his Mahabharata. No, I take great care to ensure that. And then I interpret. So retelling always involves interpretation. So, just as Sarala interpreted Vyasa's Mahabharata, the result of that interpretation was creation of a different, sort of version of Mahabharata. He created episodes. Another way of interpreting is to keep the episodes as they are, but find interpretations of them. Now, one I will exemplify here. See, those who have read whatever I have written on Sarala Mahabharata, and my reviewers, they immediately ask this question, oh, In Sarala there is no Bhagavad Gita. In Sarala Mahabharata there is no Bhagavad Gita. And yet there is discontent of Arjuna. Arjuna is reluctant to fight. So reluctance of Arjuna is there, but Gita is not there. Sarala retells the story in a very different way. I will only take 1 minute to tell his story. Arjuna, when Krishna asks Arjuna to start the war, Arjuna refuses. He says, I will not start the war, but I will sort of attack, or I'll just respond to an attack on me. I will not shoot the first arrow. Krishna does not say anything to him, simply goes to Yudhishthir and tells Yudhishthir that, look, your brother is unwilling to fight. And to cut a long story short, Yudhishthir goes to Duryodhana in the battlefield itself to try and find out if some peace could be arrived at. At that point of time, Duryodhana says he will not do anything. The war should be there. Yudhishthir goes to the extent of telling him that, look, don't do that, or if we really have to fight a war, let 105 of us fight. It is our war, let the people go back, let the soldiers go back. He doesn't agree. So anyway, sort of at that point of time, Yudhishthir says that whoever wants to come to my side, come. So one of Duryodhana's brothers decides to do that. But at the moment he made that decision, he was still in the Kaurava side. And then Duryodhana asked the army to attack his own brother, who was sheltering Yudhishthir. And then, Yudhishthir was then Arjuna said, okay, what's this noise about? Krishna said that your brother is in that situation. He said, take me there. He said, why are you worried? He's with your brother. Why are you worried? He said, no, don't taunt me, take me there. And the war starts. Now, my interpretation of this is the following. What I like most about it is that Krishna did not involve himself with the starting of the war. He was an outsider. As an outsider, he had he should not have started the war. He should not have been instrumental in the starting of the war. And the second thing is, see, Krishna is in Sarala Mahabharata. Krishna is the ultimate embodiment of pure knowledge, pure energy, and self-realization. Now, such God, such fully manifest avatar of God cannot take, cannot take an active part in the destruction of, in that kind of a destructive warfare. So Krishna is kept out of this, completely kept out of this. So the war starts. Now, the interesting point to me is, look at Arjuna's question. I'm absolutely, I'm not comparing Vyasa Mahabharata with Sarala Mahabharata as though it might look that I am doing so. But if I am doing so, one has to refer to Vyasa Mahabharata, otherwise how does it go on? In any case, I am not convinced. There's nothing about the Bhagavad Gita. It's absolutely a great document. But the situating of the Gita in the Mahabharata is not something I am convinced about. For 12 whole years in the forest, in the mind they were preparing for the war. And for months, for at least 2 or 4 months, they were preparing for the war. And Arjuna was not one of those sentimental persons. He was highly educated, a man with great sense of discrimination. Now, he cannot come and decide, no, I can't kill my own people. Look, what kind of situation was he, what was he saying? I have no problem in killing others. I want to only kill my own relations, etc., etc. Now, and even about the Bhagavad Gita itself, see, it's one thing for us to discard our clothes and wear new clothes. That's one thing. But we do it voluntarily. We are not obliged to do it. We are not compelled to do it, etc., etc. And then essentially Arjuna's problem was at the Laukika level, at the level of embodiment of Atma.
I think I am under notice because there are some persons.
Yeah, I'll just quickly. Yeah, at the level of embodiment of Atma, there is no problem when the Atma is disembodied. Disembodied Atma has no family, has no relation, no killing, no being killed. So why did Krishna resolve Arjuna's problem at a disembodied Atma level rather than the embodied Atma level? Anyway, the most important thing about this is, look at Arjuna's question. No first strike. I will not make the first strike. Now that is very important. That itself is a moral position. Now Arjuna, since that is a moral position, there can be no Bhagavad Gita, there can be no advice to tell Arjuna that, look, the position is not sufficiently moral, so what you should be doing is this. And the second thing with which I conclude,
Yeah, please, please.
And the second thing is that, that he okay, I have forgotten the second thing. So under such pressure, it's difficult to say. Yeah. So
No, we have been hassled really. I think that could have been avoided. But
so this passing on of the hassle can have its own problems.
I know. I have the fullest. No, this will call for a special session. I think if one talks about Sarala Mahabharata and Vyasa's Mahabharata, this would be a special session in itself. I do not know if we have any time for one question, but I would take one question. One question, I think we'll take 2 minutes more. One question, anyone? Two. Okay. The editor-in-chief has permitted 2 questions. So 2 questions. Two questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, good afternoon, sir. My question is to Mr. Debroy. He said that the incident of disrobing of Draupadi, Duryodhan asking her to sit on the lap was something that was acceptable at that time, and it was a position given to a wife. I would rather say, how far could that be? In a situation like that, when Duryodhan is asking his brother to drag the woman to the court, to disrobe her, and then we are interpreting that it is an exalted position that he is trying to offer as a wife. Even that, is it decent or is it obscene? And supposing it was decent, why did Bhim vow to break that tie, which he did? And if it was decent...
Good enough. The question has been carried. Mr. Debroy, you asked for it. Take it now.
The question brings in things that I had not mentioned. I just said that when that particular incident happened, Duryodhan tells Draupadi, your husbands have lost their independence. They are no longer masters of themselves. They are no longer your husbands. Choose one amongst us as your husband.
Okay. Neither are you satisfactory nor is he satisfied, and this is
Can I add to the other question that was asked?
Yeah.
I said, remember the norms. And I said, read the Mahabharata. In that day and age, contrary to what you see in films and television, women, including Draupadi, did not wear saris which were being disrobed. Men and women both wore 2 garments. One above the body, another one below the body. Except that people who were within quote slaves were not entitled to an upper garment. Before this incident happens, the male Pandavas, having become within quote slaves, had already surrendered their upper garments.
Okay.
Sir, excuse me, sir.
Okay. One more question.
Sir, I have a question to ask.
Yes, please.
Sir, has the society forgot the values which the epics have been teaching since many years due to the effort of reinterpretation?
That's all. That's a good question. I think I'll try to answer it myself because there is a ready answer available to it.
Thank you, sir.
Through some interpretation, it is available to us. It is said that Mahabharata contains 3 epical thoughts. One is Prabhritti, the other is Nivritti, and then there is Bhakti. And it has been interpreted that Prabhritti, Nivritti are antithetical to each other. One is thesis, the other is antithesis, and it is Bhakti which reconciles both, which has an element of Prabhritti and an element of Nivritti also. When you do a lot of Bhakti, whatever Bhakti you do, there is an element of satisfying your wish, desire, whatever it is, at the same time withdrawing from it also. So, Bhoga and Samarpana, both elements are there in the resolution that is achieved in the Mahabharata. So the value that you are talking of, there is no fixed value in Mahabharata. There are multiple value sets which are even contradictory to each other. Mr. Devroy mentioned about it. If you want me to show you, it's almost, you can say, it's an encyclopedia of human requirement. You open a portion and you find an answer to your question. If you want to defend women, you have portions there. If you want to offend women, there is a portion there. So that is why it is a civilizational document. And if we talk about it, I don't think Mr. Prabhu Chawla will have terrible problem in his hand. Next time, he could as well fix up a schedule where Mahabharata could be an exclusive subject to discuss if he has time for that. So, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the patience. And sorry for not giving the panelists adequate time, but even then, a little bit of an idea about the material which you are discussing would have been. And incidentally, while we rise, Mr. Professor Patnaik has remembered the lost second point.
Yeah,
and so I would give him the lost half a minute, one-fourth of a minute to say it.
One-fourth of a minute. This no first strike is a moral position in itself. You can counter it by a pragmatic argument. What will remain after you receive the first strike? That question cannot be asked to Arjuna, because Arjuna was much more powerful than all the Kaurav army taken together with their divine weapons.
First strike question is not even striking Mr. Modi today. He doesn't know who will strike first. Okay, that's a wonderful session. Thank you, gentlemen, for your cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. I would now request, sir, please be there on stage. I would request the editorial director of the New Indian Express, Mr. Prabhu Chawla, to come on stage and present mementos to all our panelists.
We are really sorry because we're running out of time, but an interesting session is going to happen after that. I accept his idea of having a full session on Mahabharata. Mahabharata is such a book, which is epic or whatever. It's many interpretation. I think next year, I promise you, I'll have 2 sessions for 2 hours each on Mahabharata and also on Ramayana. That is what they're going to do it. That's what we are going to do it. And one on Quran as well. I can promise you that also. And Madani Sahab will be there to discuss that as well.
Thank you, gentlemen. Well, we'll quickly move to our next session. This one is very interesting, Threat to Independent Writing. I would like to mention here that the Tata Group has taken special interest in this session. The Tata Group has been promoting literature for quite some time now, and it recently organized a Lit Fest in Mumbai as well. And since it has been encouraging independent writers all throughout the country, it has a special interest in this particular session, Threat to Independent Writing. And may I take the privilege now to invite the panelists onto stage.